All right, so this lesson is going to be over deductive reasoning and the symbolic logic proofs. Okay, so this is going to be our first topic over proofs. So, looking at what we have to start here. If you remember, in a previous lesson, we talked about how the original conditional and its contrapositive are logically equivalent statements. So remember that meant we could use them interchangeably. We will be able to use this to rewrite sentences so that we can apply the law of syllogism. Okay, so just to kind of briefly explain what the law of syllogism is. So you might have two or more sentences, and you are going to use them to write out a conclusion, but they have to kind of have something in common to connect the sentences. So just using our symbolic notation, a lot of times you'll see if P, then Q, if Q, then R. So like I said, you want to be able to connect the two sentences, and here we're able to do that by having the first sentence ending with Q, and our next sentence, the part that should follow, should begin with that. We should pick up where we left off, and then we're talking about something after. That's why I'm just using another letter for that R. Okay, and so what the law of syllogism is, it allows you to connect those two sentences to say therefore, so those are what the dots mean or implies. Therefore, if P, then R. Okay, so that part that is talked about in both sentences is going to disappear. It's our overlap, and we're just going to be left with our very first hypothesis connected with our last conclusion. Okay, a lot of times you'll see this in just two sentences, but we might have multiple, and you'll actually see that in our next lesson as well. Okay, so moving on to the example we have down below. If you can play the banjo, then you have practiced very hard. If you can't play O Susanna, then you haven't practiced very hard. Okay, so it doesn't quite right off the bat look like we have something in common. We're not ending with something and then starting the next sentence with that same thing. But we do have one part in each sentence that does kind of have the same thing being talked about. Okay, so if we look here, we have that practicing very hard, and then we have you haven't practiced very hard. Okay, so remember, once again, up above, we talked about how that contrapositive and conditional statement are logically equivalent. So what we can do is we're ending with haven't practiced very hard. If I can move in that second sentence, that part of the sentence to the front to become my hypothesis, then I almost have where I can use that law of syllogism. The thing I have to take into consideration is in one, we are practicing hard, and the other, we aren't. But remember, contrapositive, not only will it switch the order, but it will negate that for us as well. Okay, so what I'm going to do is just down below, I'm going to kind of write out what our new sentence will read as. Okay, so zooming in real quick. We will have if you have practiced very hard, then you can play O Susanna. Okay, so that's what that sentence, that second sentence will actually read as now. And like I said, that has exactly what we're looking for. Okay, in the first part of it, first sentence, sorry, we have that you have practiced very hard. Now in that second sentence, once we've done that contrapositive, we will have that same, you have practiced very hard. So we'll be able to write our conclusion. And so I'm going to write my conclusion down below here of what we will have. We will have, sorry. If you can play the banjo, then you can play Oh Susanna. Okay, and that would be my conclusion. All right, so let's look at some problems down below. Okay, so for these 4 problems, we've got our instructions that say we're going to write each sentence in if-then form using symbols or keywords. Okay, we've seen those keywords in a previous notes where I kind of use those. For today's lesson, I'm going to mainly probably use colors because that's going to be helpful for me. And then sometimes I might switch it up and use the words as well. But whatever works best for you is fine. Okay, so then they're telling us to replace a sentence with its contrapositive if needed. Okay, so only the contrapositive. We're not going to write the converse or the inverse. And we can also switch the 2 sentences if needed. Okay, so to clarify what that means, because a lot of people mix this up with the converse. Like I said, we're not using the converse. What they're saying here is instead of it being sentence 1, we can make it sentence 2. And that's what they're talking about with the switching the 2 sentences. Okay, and then we'll write whether we were able to come up with a conclusion or not. And if there is the conclusion, we should be writing out what it's saying. Okay, so like I said, that's going to be that law of syllogism from above, where you're going to connect the first if with the last then to make your conclusion. Okay, so let's look at this first example here. Okay, so I'm going to use pink for if your children can copy their term papers, they will have more time to watch television. Okay, I'm going to change that to blue because it's something different. It wasn't matching that first. Then in the second sentence, it says, if you buy an encyclopedia. Well, that wasn't used up above. That wasn't talked about there. So I'm going to come up with a different color just so that I know that it's something different. Okay. Your children can copy their term papers from it. Well, that was mentioned up above. That was my P. That was that pink one I used. So I'm going to highlight that in pink. So like I said, what we want to do, remember, is have our first sentence ending with what we're talking about in both sentences, and the second sentence is going to start off with it. Well, if you notice, if I were to switch the order in these 2 sentences, okay, so here, if I switch the order, then that will leave me with what I need. Okay, so I'm going to zoom in real quick, and we're going to write out what our conclusion will be saying. So our conclusion is going to be if Sorry, I was looking for where I had it. So if you buy an encyclopedia, then then they will have more time to watch television. I'm going to just use TV to shorthand that. All right, so that's how we're going to get that conclusion there. Moving into our second problem. Okay, you're going to do the same thing with the highlighting. So if a lawn is made of astroturf. Okay, so I'm going to start off with pink there. I'm always just going to go in the same order. First one's going to be pink. So if a lawn is made of astroturf, then it is always green. Okay. In my second sentence, we have a lawn is always green. So that's going to match up with that blue one if it gets plenty of water. Okay. So something I just want to remind you of, because this one can be a little tricky, is that we have that keyword if right here. Okay, so really this sentence is saying if it gets plenty of water, then a lawn is always green. Okay, well, let me just kind of write out those keywords just because this one, it might be easier for y'all to kind of see it. Okay, so I'm going to have, let's have astro, turf, and green. And then in that second sentence, like I said, that if is in the middle. So we're actually going to start off with plenty of water. So I'll use water. And then we'll have that green. Okay. So if we look at this here, we need one of them to be in the hypothesis spot. Currently, we have both in the conclusion. Well, the only way to bring one of them to the hypothesis without negating it is to write the converse. But as I mentioned earlier, we are only allowed to use the contrapositive because it is an equivalent statement to the original conditional. Okay, if we write that converse or that inverse, that's not always going to be true. So in this case, we're actually not going to be able to come up with a conclusion statement. And so this will be a no conclusion possible answer. Okay, so let me just go ahead and write that out. All right, and we can move into number 3. Zoom out so we can see it. All right, so number 3. If you read Newsweek magazine, okay, so I'm going to highlight that first hypothesis, then you like cats. If you are fond of mice, okay, well, that wasn't mentioned above, then you do not like cats. All right, so if we look here, we do have an overlap, but in one sentence, we don't have that word not, and in another we do. So this is where we get to use that contrapositive to rewrite our sentence so that it will work out. Okay, so that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to just rewrite with the contrapositive. Oops. So if you like cats, then you are not fond of mice. Oops. Okay, so now if I were to highlight this, just so we can kind of see it, we're talking about the liking cats at the beginning, and then not being fond of mice is going to be at the end. Okay, and so you'll see here we are ending one sentence with you like cats and starting the next with you like cats. Okay, so we'll be able to use that law of syllogism to say that if you read Newsweek magazine, then you are not fond of mice. Okay, so that's going to be my conclusion here. I keep accidentally starting off with that highlighter. Okay, so if you read Newsweek magazine, then you aren't fond of mice. Okay. All right, the last one for this section, we have all animals get hungry. So breaking that down, all animals, and then get hungry is kind of the second thing that they're talking about here. And then in that second sentence, we have no hard workers are hungry. All right. Once again, this is something we talked about in a previous lesson. So before I even highlight this one, I'm going to just rewrite it because this is a tough case. We're starting off with that no. Okay, so I'm just going to rewrite this one using that tough case. Okay, so remember that tough case, instead of saying no hard workers, if you remember, we're going to actually start off with if you are a hard worker. Then, and so remember, when we get to that conclusion, we're going to insert that not. Okay, so then you are not hungry. Okay, so now that we have our sentence, Okay, we're going to just go through and let's highlight them. So, using my highlighter. If you are a hard worker. So, that was not anything that was mentioned up above in that first sentence. Okay, so I'm going to highlight that in green. Then you are not hungry. Okay, so that's going to go with that getting hungry that we talked about in the first sentence. So I highlighted it in blue. All right, so once again, we notice we do have something in common for both of them. They are both at the end. They are in the conclusions. But because one of them is negated, we can use that contrapositive to actually write our conclusion. Okay, so for some of you, kind of like how I did in the previous one, it might be helpful to rewrite it out. If you don't have to, then that's fine. So in this one, I'm going to go ahead and skip over that, and we're just going to go ahead and jump straight into what our conclusion will say. Okay, so we'll have that if you are an animal, or if it's an animal, that's however you want to kind of write that out to begin with. Then, okay, and remember when we do that contrapositive on that second sentence, it's actually going to read as, if you are hungry, then you are not a hard worker. Okay, so that means my conclusion for that sentence is going to say you are not a hard worker, which is how I'm going to use, or what I'm going to use for the ending of my conclusion. Okay, so okay, so that's how I got my final conclusion using that law of syllogism. Okay, so just another thing that does tend to kind of confuse people is just know that when they're telling you to write your conclusion statement or write no conclusion possible, they're not looking for the conclusion, that cue that we use of a sentence. It's you actually writing a statement out from all of the sentences that were given to us. Okay, we're trying to combine them into that one statement. All right, so now let's look at what the next part of these notes are asking for us to do. All right, so in these, we are actually just determining if the third statement that follows comes from the first two. Okay, so if that will make sense. If it does, we're going to write valid and give the pattern of reasoning. So remember, with that, we're allowed to write the original, we're allowed to write the contrapositive, because they are, once again, going to be logically equivalent statements. But if we have to use the converse or the inverse to make that third sentence follow, we're actually going to write that it is invalid and then just state which of the two errors we were using. Okay, so let's look at number 5. So we have, if the stones are rolling. Okay. They are not gathering moss. If the stones are not gathering moss, okay, so that's going to be that same thing. They are a smooth group of rocks. Okay, that's something different. So we're going to highlight it in a different color. So if we look at the sentence that they wrote, therefore, if the stones are rolling, okay, so we have the two overlapping here, okay, where they're using the exact same thing. They're talking about it to connect the two. So that's going to be starting off with this hypothesis, which is what we have. they are a smooth group of rocks is my conclusion for that conclusion. Therefore, this is going to be a valid statement. Okay, so we're going to write out that it is valid. And since we didn't actually have to write the contrapositive, that's where we're going to write that it is using the original statement. Okay. All right, now let's look at number 6. Okay, in number 6 we have, if a penny has an Indian head on it, it is very old. All right, and then in the second sentence, we have, if a penny has an Indian head on it, then it is worth, let me see one sec, worth more than 1 cent. Sorry, I zoomed in too far and couldn't read that. All right, so let's look at the conclusion. It says, therefore, if a penny is very old, it is worth more than 1 cent. Okay. Now, like we had done previously in some of the other problems up above, we will notice here that the part that they have in common is on the same side of the sentences. Okay, they're both going to be the hypothesis in the sentences. And the only way for us to move that to the end of one sentence is for us to do the contrapositive. But when we do that, it makes it negated, and so that won't actually line up anymore. So that's why this one here is going to be an invalid statement. Okay, because we're going to actually have to use the converse in order to switch the order and make sure that we don't negate it. Okay, so if you're having to switch the order, but the sentences read this, or sorry, not the sentences, the statements read the same. So here it was a penny has an Indian head on it. A penny has an Indian head on it is in the second sentence as well. The only way for us to get that to work is going to be to use the converse. All right, we got 2 more, and then we're going to talk about our proofs. All right, so for number 7, going to start off the same way we have been. We're going to highlight. So I have, if you walk under a coconut tree, you will probably be hit on the head. And then in our second sentence, it says, if you visit Hawaii, which that wasn't mentioned anywhere up above, so I'm going to highlight that in green, then you will walk under coconut trees. And that was what we had highlighted in pink previously, so I'm going to use that same color. So our sentence, our conclusion statement reads, therefore, if you visit Hawaii, you will probably be hit on the head. Okay, so if we look at this one, even though, it looks a little funky here, remember, one of the options they told us that we could do was for us to switch the order without writing the contrapositive, converse, or inverse. We can just switch the order of these two, and that's actually what they're doing here. Okay, because if we notice, they mentioned that they're starting off with, if you visit Hawaii, which is the start of this sentence. So they're starting with this sentence here, and they're actually using this one second after it. Okay. But no changes are having to be made other than just switching that order. So we are going to write that this is a valid statement. And then once again, it is just going to be the original statement. All right. Now in our last problem for that section, we have blondes have more fun. So the first thing they're talking about is being a blonde. And then the second thing is having more fun. Okay. And then we have in our second sentence, a girl has more fun. Okay, so that same thing is being said here if she is saucy. Okay, so that is new. That's something different. But just once again, I want to note that right here is where my if is. Okay, so this is actually stating, I'm going to write it in terms of my keywords. If she is saucy, then she has more fun. So I'm just going to use the word fun there. All right. So if we look at what we had originally highlighted, okay, the more fun was the blue, and the saucy was the green. Okay, so let's look now in comparison to what we had. Well, if we notice, both blues in those two sentences are in the conclusion spot. Okay, in order for us to get one of them to move to the front, we will either have to write the converse or the contrapositive, because both of those will switch the order. But we have to think, do we need it negated? Well, we don't. Okay, we need it to stay exactly how it is, just to switch the order. So we're actually going to have to write the converse in order for that to happen. So because we are writing the converse, we know that this is going to be an invalid statement, and my error is going to be that it was a converse that was used. All right, so we are almost done. We're now moving into the last part, and that is going to be our logic proofs. Okay, and proofs are something that will come up quite a lot in this school year. So we want to kind of get used to just using these basics and the easier proofs so that we understand them and we don't forget them when they become a little bit more challenging, because these will be the easiest proofs you have all year round. Okay, so let's look at what it says over here. So for these proofs, we're actually only going to have 3 reasons, and your 3 reasons are given, contrapositive. A lot of times they have it written out as contrapositive of, and you would tell me which statement. The way we have y'all in this class write your proofs are flow proofs. So you actually don't have to worry about that. You just have to say contrapositive. And then in the last one, we have syllogism of, and you would tell me which 2 sentences. But like I said, because of the flow proofs and the way they're formatted, you're already going to be telling me which 2 sentences you are using. So we'll just have to write the word syllogism. Okay, so some things I'm going to highlight and talk about here. Let's see, we've got the fact that there's only 3 reasons. Okay, so don't come up with any other ones. You only need to use one of these 3. And something I do want to mention here is just that for our proofs, when you are giving a reason, you're telling me why You want to make sure that you are boxing. So you can box it. They're already pre-boxed down below, so we're just going to fill those in. I will allow you to also highlight them. You can circle it as well, but one of these needs to be happening for your reasons. Okay, I'm just telling you now that will be points off. The reason why we have you do this is because it should be clear and concise. It should tell me exactly what's happening. And if you don't have that, you don't have it boxed, highlighted, or circled, everything's just going to start blending together, and it makes it hard for me to figure out what's going on. Okay, so you need to make sure that you are boxing your reasons so that you don't lose a point. All right, so just some quick things before we start working through that first proof. We have a true statement may be replaced by its contrapositive because they are equivalent as discussed previously. Okay, so just throwing out some highlighting. All right, and then an example below is just kind of showing you that if they've got those little squigglies in front, remember, we do use those to refer to as not, okay? And so that just meaning that they have negated it if it appears, or if it disappears in something afterwards, it means that we are once again negating it. We're taking that part out of it, okay? And then we have the law of syllogism. States that if PQ and then we have if Q and then R, then we will have that if P then R. So that's all that's saying. It's what I had talked about, if you remember, at the top of our notes when we first started off. All right. So just to kind of mention, I'm going to talk through a little bit of what I'm doing while I'm going through this, but just so you are aware, this will not appear on your proofs. You will actually be drawing all of this out, writing it all out on your own. You will have a blank space when you are taking a quiz or a test. So don't get used to this. Even in y'all's homework for it, this will not be there. You'll actually be writing it out yourself. So these are just pre-filled in so we can kind of talk about what's going on and just so we can see how we can possibly start. So over here we have given, and we have if A, then not B. If C, then B. And then we'll have in that last one, if not C, then not D. We are trying to prove that if A, then not D. So given those three statements, we want to prove if A, then not D. Okay, so best way to start a proof is going to be with your givens. If you notice here, all three of these are going to match up to this given here. Okay, so guess what your reason's going to be? Given. Okay, so we're going to fill in given for all three of those top boxes because that's where we are coming up with those. Sorry, my dog is sleeping right next to me. All right. Now that we have that, that should be the easy part. I never want to see blank proof because you can always start with your givens. That's where you want to start. Okay. And if you notice, they didn't really do it in order, and that's fine. This is just the order they decided to put it in. Okay. So what I'm doing, I'm going to just kind of look here at these first two that are in these, like that's in the screen. And we will see that with these two statements, they both have in common that C. Okay, well, they both have C there, but one has that not. So what I'm trying to do is I want to get rid of the not, and so that I can use my syllogism. And we know that's probably going to be used because it's one of the three. We only have three to pick from. And by the way, to clarify, you are officially done with your reasons being given because we have written out all the givens. Okay, so these 4 boxes that are left over should not have that word given because they do not appear in what was given to you. Okay, so we're going to have to talk about where we get them from. Well, here, like I said, they both have C. We just need to negate this. And if we negate it, then it will match up. And if we switch the order, it will move it to the end of this sentence, kind of how they did here. So if you look, they have negated and switched the order to get if D, then C, so that we could then eventually use that syllogism since it will end in one and begin in the other with that C. Okay, so that is going to be contrapositive for this reason. Okay, and like I said, I'm trying to explain where they're coming up with these, why they're doing it, not just kind of going in straight to what is it right off the bat. So we've got that contrapositive, and like I said, then we'll notice here that they both have that C in it. One's the end, one's the beginning. So then we are able to use that syllogism to come up with this statement here. So if you remember, I mentioned up above how it said syllogism of, and then there was the 2 blanks. We don't need that because if you look, if you are doing this flow proof correctly, you are pointing out which 2 it is coming from. Okay, so I'm just going to fill in syllogism as my reason. All right, now let's zoom out and come over here. Okay, so if we look between where I ended right here, this statement and that last given, looking between those, I will notice that they both have the letter B. Okay, they both have that letter B in them. Now, once again, we'll notice that here it is just B, and over here it is not B. So we need to get rid of that not that's in front of it. And in order for us to do that, we are going to be negating it, but also needing to switch it so that it moves to the front. Okay, because once again, I want to stress, converse, inverse are not reasons for your proofs. You only use given, contrapositive, and syllogism. Okay, so here we are going to be writing out that we are using the contrapositive. To get that sentence. Okay, and once we have that new sentence, that new statement, we are able to use that syllogism because it is ending in one sentence and beginning in the next with that letter B. So we can use syllogism to come up with that if D, then not A. Which, if we look back over here at what we were trying to prove, that has the 2 letters in there of what we were trying to prove. But is it the exact same thing? So let's look back over here. Was it the exact same thing? Well, no, because they wanted us to say if A, then not B. So that order needs to switch, and we need to negate them. So we are going to be using the contrapositive. Okay? So you know you are done with a proof when you have exactly what you were trying to prove. Okay, so we end in the prove. That's how we know we're done. Something else I want to mention, just because I will state it multiple times in class probably, and you will still try to do it, but prove is never a reason. It doesn't justify how you got it. So you should never use that term prove as one of your reasons. We can use given because that's where we're getting it from, but you should not be using prove. All right, now let's just look down below. I'm going to kind of go through this one a little bit faster, but something to kind of mention with this one here is the same proof may be done correctly in more than one way. Okay, so you and the person next to you might not have the exact same answer, exact same way of going through it, and that's fine. So if we look here, this is actually supposed to be the exact same problem as above. It's the same given, same proofs that they're giving us. But if you notice, let me zoom out for you, you can clearly see that these were not solved the same way. They don't look the exact same. Okay, so they just found another way of solving this one. And like I said, that's fine as long as it is correct and you are not using incorrect reasons. You should be good. So once again, you should always be starting off with your givens. Oops. Let me erase that real quick. Okay. All right. So we know we want A. We know we want that D, technically not D, to be in it. And so I'm just, instead of how I did it up above, I will notice that in this given here, we have that A. In this given here, we have the B that was being used over here. It's just not saying not B. So we are clearly going to, in order to combine those two sentences to get towards using that third given, need to use the contrapositive. So that I can actually then use syllogism to connect those two into one sentence. Okay, and just to clarify why I know I'm doing this, well, I know that I need an A. This one had it. And I know I need a not D. This one has it over here. But if you look at the other two in those two givens, they are not the letters that will allow me to use those two right away to get my sentence. I need to connect one of them to change into the other. So I'm connecting this given here to this one so that I can get that letter C, which will actually turn into a not C, which I need to connect to that given to get to the D. Okay. Which with these, it just comes with practicing it so that you can kind of see those patterns, see where you want to go with it. And down below, if we look, we will notice that we have that not C in both of them. Okay. And it's the ending of one, beginning of the next. So we can go straight into our syllogism. To connect those two sentences. And we get if A, then not D, which is what we were trying to prove. All right, so that is it for this lesson. Hopefully it was helpful. And like I said, with these proofs, I know it is a little confusing at first. You just have to practice, okay? But like I said, the only three reasons starting off with this lesson, with this unit is going to be given, contrapositive, and syllogism. Okay, that's the only three we want to be using.